meeting with the academic world and the general public, with invited speakers from abroad, focusing this time on the archaeology of islands. As you all know, 2021 marked the 30th anniversary of the ARU since its foundation in 1991, but also a very sad loss, that of the ARU's founder and first director, late Professor Emeritus Vassos Karagiorgis. Vassos Karagiorgis has left behind a magnificent legacy, having contributed immensely to the consolidation of Cypriot archaeology, both locally and internationally. The University of Cyprus owes him a lot, while we at the ARU share the aim of his lifetime work and vision for the study and promotion of the cultural heritage of Cyprus, neighboring regions, and island cultures. In this framework, the ARU has a great honor of hosting Professor Scott Fitzpatrick to open the 57th Zoom public lecture series dedicated to the archaeology of islands this semester, with a presentation that will tackle with issues familiar to most of us, such as seafaring, colonization, exchange, and island life in another insular world, that of the Caribbean and the Pacific. Scott Fitzpatrick is professor at the Department of Anthropology of the University of Oregon in the United States, associate director for research of the Museum for Natural and Cultural History at the same university since 2017, and founding co-editor of the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology since 2005. Professor Fitzpatrick is an archaeologist who specializes in the prehistory and historical ecology of island and coastal regions, particularly the Pacific and Caribbean. He was awarded his doctoral title from the University of Oregon in 2003, and before he moved to the same institution to take up his position as associate professor in 2012, he taught as assistant and associate professor at the North Carolina State University. Much of our today's speaker's research focuses on colonization events, seafaring strategies, adaptations to smaller islands, exchange systems, chronometric techniques, and human impacts on ancient environments. He has active field projects in Palau in Western Micronesia, on several islands in the Caribbean, and on the Oregon coast. He has received a large number of grants from several funding bodies and has been nominated or has received several prestigious awards. Professor Fitzpatrick is the founding co-editor of the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology, associate editor for the journal Archaeology in Oceania, and serves as a consulting editor and as a member of the editorial board for several other journals. He has published more than 150 journal articles, book chapters, conference papers, and edited books, much of it based on active field projects he has conducted in Western Micronesia and the Southern Caribbean. Closing this introduction, I would like to kindly ask all our participants to now switch off their cameras and mute their microphones to avoid potential background noise and connection interruption during the lecture. Should you wish to address a question or comment to our speaker, please feel free to use the chat button on Zoom. You may also switch on your cameras after the end of the presentation to address your question directly to the speaker by raising your hand and unmuting your microphone. Dear Scott, we look forward to hearing all about your ongoing field research and how oceanographic effects influenced the prehistoric colonization of islands. Off to you.
Thank you for the very nice introduction, and it really is a pleasure to be here. So welcome everybody, and thanks for joining. I first really got my, initial archaeological experience working on an island in the Southern Caribbean, in Barbados, and I was able to work with a team from University College London, and as an undergraduate, really being away from home, out of the country for the first time, and working on this really beautiful promontory overlooking the ocean. That time I had was really pivotal to structuring how I went about going about becoming an archaeologist and working on islands. And so I spent the next several years working with that same team in Barbados, and then decided for my PhD I kind of wanted something a little bit different. something a little larger in scope. And I decided to go to U of O, University of Oregon, for my PhD, and with the idea that I wanted to work in the Pacific. And so over the next 7 years, I worked on a number of different islands in Polynesia and Micronesia. And through that time, these varied experiences working in different island regions really kind of got me thinking about, how did people really get to islands, and what did they do when they got there? And what were some of the issues that people's faced in trying to find some of what were really remote islands in the past. And so what I'd like to talk about today is a number of different things. And so here's kind of the outline. I'd like to kind of go over a little bit about the interaction versus isolation debate that we've had in island archaeology over the last, really for decades now. What we see in terms of a general history of maritime movements based on research that's been done in the Pacific, Mediterranean, Caribbean for the most part. And then I'd like to use the Caribbean as a case study, looking at what we see archaeologically happening in terms of settlement of these islands, looking at chronologies and potential origin points of where these indigenous peoples originally came from, and then provide a comparison of the Pacific, looking at how the Pacific was colonized, and using some case studies within the Pacific, including a place where I have worked for a long time, Palau in Western Micronesia, and then Magellan's voyage as well. And we've done a number of different things, not just archaeologically, but in terms of seafaring simulations to try and answer some of these questions. And really just to tie things together, why winds and currents have really mattered in terms of how people have gotten to islands in the past. So when we look at different types of maritime movements, we can kind of break this down into 3 different categories. And this is something that Broodbank had talked about and described in an earlier paper about 16, 17 years ago. So seagoing is basically tentative movements. These are using some very simple kinds of watercraft. They're not always directional, and can sometimes be essentially accidental, at least in terms of where you end up. Seafaring is a little bit different. So when we use the term seafaring, we're talking about more adept maneuvers, more advanced technologies. Peoples have some kind of navigational, or what would be more accurately termed wayfinding skills. And they also have a means of propulsion. So for example, paddling. This is often, but not always, directional. And then we move into something we call voyaging. And so there's a big difference here. Voyaging is really ideologically driven. We have greater technological sophistication. So we're starting to see the uses of sails and things like outriggers in different parts of the world. And these are ultra long range. So this is really where we're starting to see peoples moving in some kind of watercraft over very long distances. And really what's important here is return trips. So return trips are really paramount. You want to get back to where you came from if you can. Okay, so this kind of is I'm going to show you a series of charts here, and this just shows what we see in terms of island colonization over the last basically million years. Okay, so there's a long time span, and on the left-hand margin, you see distance in kilometers, and this is from 0 to 200 kilometers, and then we have time on the bottom. And so the first real island that we see colonized by some kind of hominin is on the island of Flores in Indonesia. And this happens between about 800 to 900,000 years ago. We see artifacts from Homo erectus. We see other evidence of Homo erectus in other parts of the archipelago, but Flores was never connected to another landmass. And so peoples had to have gotten there using some type of watercraft, even if it was just accidental and it was a simple, bamboo or other type of raft. There's a long period of time then that goes by, and we don't start to see other places colonized until much, much later. So we see Australia, at least by 50,000, maybe a little bit earlier. We see other islands around New Guinea, like the Solomons and the Bismarck Archipelago, the Ryukyus, south of Japan, islands in the Mediterranean. So these are happening, over the last 50 to 10,000 years or so, and then creeping into this other slice of time you see there in the green, which is, so basically we're talking about 900,000 years, a pretty big gap between when you first see an island colonized or settled by humans, and then later on. So here's a time slice now of the last 15,000 years. And you'll see that the distances here are much greater. On the left-hand side, this goes up to 7,000 kilometers away. So these are just straight line distances. They don't, we know that's not a practical or even feasible way to move across water, but just, for sake of argument. So we see the Channel Islands that are colonized by at least 13,000 years, but these are very close to the mainland. And as we get later in time, we start to see peoples moving farther and farther distances, including New Zealand, Hawaii, Madagascar, and then we eventually see Columbus getting to the Americas. So we see kind of a scattering, but also a major acceleration of peoples developing new technologies. They're able to go farther, and they're able to do it in less amounts of time, presumably. Okay, so what about interaction and isolation? So kind of with that concept of peoples through time moving to different places and doing so over greater distances, how do we kind of structure these ideas about how peoples have moved around using watercraft in the world's seas and oceans? So islands have often been conceived as, or were conceived of as, cultural laboratories. And this is something that Margaret Mead used to talk about in her, and she was really struck by working in the Manua group of Samoa, where she did some of her early research, and was really sort of, caught with this idea that when peoples get to islands, they develop these new cultural traits, they become sort of isolated in a way, and that islands can essentially serve as cultural laboratories. We see scholars moving into the 1960s, like Andrew Sharp, suggesting that, well, when we look at the Pacific, and the Pacific is 1/3 of the world's surface area, that colonization of the Pacific really couldn't have been purposeful for the most part, that it must have been accidental. And this is even after Europeans had been moving around the Pacific for hundreds of years, recognizing the skills that Polynesians and Micronesians had in moving to different islands, and doing so with a lot of skill and prowess, but still making this argument. And then we have the famous Kon-Tiki voyage with Tor Heyerdahl, who was saying that colonization of Polynesia was from South America, which sort of went against a lot of the archaeological evidence that we even had back in the 1940s, but suggesting that it wasn't purposeful necessarily, but it was accidental, that peoples are basically at the whim of winds and currents, but did show that it was possible to do so. And then we have this notion that's really, I think, become more prominent over the last 20 years, is that islands were never really truly isolated, that interaction was universal. And so what I've tried to do in my career is working in different areas. They're very different, but have some similarities too, is to really examine, we're kind of moving from one pendulum to another, that colonization of islands was accidental. And now we're seeing scholars saying, well, the archaeological evidence and the genetic evidence and other lines of evidence are suggesting that it was happening all the time. And I think there's probably a middle ground in there, which is in some ways historically contingent and temporally contingent as well. So let's kind of look at this from a Caribbean perspective. Okay, so here's the Caribbean. And for those of you who might not be completely familiar with some of the nomenclature that we use to describe these different island groups, what we have here is the Greater Antilles. So this is Cuba, Jamaica, Hispaniola, and Puerto Rico. We have the Lesser Antilles, which forms a very typical island arc, which is geologically young and volcanically active. We have the Bahamas, which are very low-lying islands. And these are not technically in the Caribbean Sea, but culturally they are related to peoples who settled other islands in the Caribbean. So we're kind of grouping those together there. And then we have a scattering of islands along the the northern South American coast, including Trinidad and Tobago and so on. And some of these islands are grouped occasionally into the Lesser Antilles. So the Lesser Antilles is sometimes used to describe all of these that we see in the South, but just for sake of argument, we do see islands that are close to the South American mainland that are have different settlement histories than we see with the rest of the Lesser Antilles. So to give you kind of a brief summary of what we see archaeologically is how these islands and when these islands are settled. So the first evidence that we see has often been termed the lithic, and we now kind of call it the archaic. This happens between about 8,000 and 5,000 years ago. And the first islands that we see colonized are Cuba and Hispaniola. but the evidence is very ephemeral. We don't see a lot of really good evidence for it. We don't see a lot of really good radiocarbon chronologies dating to this time period, and we don't really know exactly where they were coming from. A lot of people have made the argument that they were coming from somewhere in Mesoamerica. Others have suggested that it was South America, or maybe a mixture of both. But really, it's kind of fuzzy in terms of our understanding of this. Now, we then also see Trinidad settled about this time. And Trinidad has some very early evidence about 7,000 years ago, but Trinidad was also connected to the South American mainland during the late Pleistocene and into probably the early Holocene. And so I kind of look at Trinidad as being a little bit different, just because even today it's so close that if you're a good swimmer, you can go from Venezuela to Trinidad if you'd like. Okay, and the next major movement of populations that we see is definitely what we call the Archaic, and this happens between about 5,000 and 2,500 years ago. And what we see in terms of colonization is we see Trinidad and Tobago. We see some islands in the northern Lesser Antilles moving across into the Greater Antilles. And we really don't still know where they're coming from. We think they're probably coming from northern South America. At least that's what the archaeological evidence seems to suggest. And we don't really have any good evidence from Mesoamerica or from the Gulf Coast of the United States, like Florida. So again, we're seeing kind of this patchwork of islands that are colonized at different points in time, and we're really just trying to make sense of it. Okay, the next major movement we see is called Saladoid. These are horticulturalists. They're making some very distinctive kinds of pottery, and we can connect that pottery to South America. There's really no question, but we're not exactly sure how these peoples moved into the islands. So we used to say that it was probably a movement in a stepping stone pattern, because these islands are relatively close to South America, and from the southern islands up to Puerto Rico, we see really the same kinds of pottery generally, and a lot of the same kinds of other artifacts. And then we see kind of a gap. So if I can go back to Saladoid here, what we see is we see all the Saladoid peoples not moving past Puerto Rico until about almost 1,000 years later in some cases. So Puerto Rico seems to be a staging area and a jumping off point later on, where now some other islands are colonized by ceramic making peoples that are connected to this early Saladoid group. So we see the Bahamas colonized, we see Jamaica colonized for the first time. But interestingly, this is the first evidence we have of peoples getting to the Bahamas and Jamaica, even though they're in very close proximity to Cuba and Hispaniola and other islands. And we don't see any archaeological evidence before Europeans arrive in the Cayman Islands. So again, here we see kind of a real patchwork that is temporally different. Okay, so that's kind of curious to archaeologists. Now, if we look at radiocarbon sequences for these, and you don't need to look at this too closely other than to see that if it's a darker color, these are settled pretty early, and if they're a lighter color, they're settled much later in time. So again, illustrating that when we look at the radiocarbon dates, we see some islands colonized very early, whereas some islands are colonized very late. So how do we explain this? Okay, so if we look at this movement of Saladoid peoples beginning about 2,500 years ago, now this is some of that distinctive pottery. This is called zone and size crosshatch. And if we look at the earliest dates for Saladoid in the Caribbean, they're happening in Puerto Rico. And if we look at the radiocarbon dates for Saladoid or related material later, they become progressively younger as you move south through the islands. And so this suggested to Richard Callahan, who began to run some seafaring simulations, that maybe peoples who colonized the islands during this time didn't go in a stepping stone pattern northward, but maybe they got to the northern islands first and then came south. And that was kind of a very unique and interesting perspective. It was met with a lot of skepticism, and people were, I think, at least established scholars in the Caribbean initially were kind of turned off by this idea. Okay, so when we look at the Caribbean, though, in terms of what we see as pretty good archaeological evidence. This is also kind of incorporating a lot of the genetic evidence that's happened lately. We're trying to answer this question: from where did indigenous peoples in the Caribbean originate, and what can explain this pattern of colonization? Well, we really don't have any good evidence for peoples colonizing the Caribbean from the Gulf Coast of the United States. We don't see anything in Florida or Texas or even farther west. We have some limited evidence, and people have made some pretty good arguments that maybe Mesoamerica, particularly Belize or the Yucatan Peninsula, may have been a staging area for these really early peoples coming into Cuba. But again, the evidence is very ephemeral, and there's not really good radiocarbon chronologies that connect these two places. So I'm putting a question mark there for now. As we move south, there's really nothing from around Honduras or Nicaragua. As we get down to the isthmus here with Panama and Costa Rica and Colombia, there is some pretty good iconographic evidence that we see maybe linking these groups to the Caribbean. But whether they left from this area and went north or east or wherever is sort of up in the air. Okay. We don't see any evidence from Bermuda. So Bermuda is never colonized by peoples before Europeans arrive. We see the Cayman Islands, never colonized either. We see a scattering of islands off the coast of Central America that don't have any evidence archaeologically for these Caribbean groups that are coming in. So if we look at some similarities in material culture, what do we see in terms of trying to connect these places? Okay, so we see various artifacts made of stone. It's not really a common artifact material per se compared to other things like pottery, but we do find them, fairly regularly in archaeological sites. A lot of these are made from greenstone, and some of these are made into like emblems or pendants and things like that definitely look like they're related to places like South America, or maybe the Isthmus region around Panama and Costa Rica. There's lots of precious stones. There's a lapidary tradition, particularly after about 500 BC when Saladoid groups move in. This seems to increase after about AD 500. And we see these materials from jadeite, or jadatites, or serpentinites, and these are made into very distinctive kinds of artifacts that seem related to places maybe in South America or parts of Central America. We see different kinds of what we call guaizas or masks. Some of these are made out of shell. A lot of these were put, presumably they're smaller, so they're put on sort of the ends of staffs, perhaps. We see material like you see on the left. That gold inlay is actually called tumbaga, or in the Caribbean, we call it guanine. And this is kind of a gold copper alloy, and there's no real place in the Caribbean where we've seen that. And so it's probably coming from somewhere in South America. Lots of really great artifacts are coming in. Some of these are made from perishable materials like wood, and the ones on the left here have bowls on the top, and these are used to crush up seeds from a plant that used to make a hallucinogenic snuffing powder called cahoba. And here are some of these used. The artifacts that you see on the bottom right are from South America, parts of the Andean region where this snuffing tradition was very prominent. And we see some iconographic imagery and some inlays and things that seem related to South America as well. And on the top left, you see the pod of this particular plant, which is sort of like a legume. So they would take the seeds from these pods, crush them up, and they contain dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, which is a very, very powerful hallucinogen and is known to have been used in South America for thousands of years. We also see in the Caribbean a unique kind of artifact, and we call these sometimes three-pointers. The triangle shape in the Caribbean is very important. We see a number of different artifacts that we call zemis or semis that are found. Some of these are quite large and some are quite small. And these seem to be related to the shapes of these islands in the Lesser Antilles, which are very high and mountainous. and from the sea kind of have this triangle shape to them. So these are very powerful objects. These hold what we would call a lot of mana. People who owned these would try and protect them from being stolen. They would sometimes plant these in agricultural fields to produce a good harvest. But these are sort of very, spiritually powerful objects that we see used in the Caribbean that also have some iconography that's related seemingly to South America or parts of Central America. These are ones that we found on a project that I worked on a small little island of Carriacou in the southern Grenadines. And we see some very kind of simple ones with chevron shapes on the top. The one on the far left here has a human face on it. And then the bottom right is ceramic, but also showing not only a triangle shape, but also a repeated triangle motif within it. And this is known as a body stamp. And so these would be used to place on a pigment and then used to kind of stamp the body in different kinds of decorations. So suffice to say, this triangle shape is pretty important. When we look at the source of jadeite or serpentinite sources, it used to be thought there were really no local sources in the Caribbean. We did find quite a bit, or ones that were known in Mesoamerica and South America. But when we look now, recent research has showed that we do have some local sources of both of these materials in the Caribbean. And when we see other locations where they might be found, a lot of these are in South America versus Central America. So when we look at where these materials are sourced to, we do see some sourcing of materials that are local. And we also see in Guatemala, there's a source called Motagua, which is a jadeite source that was used by peoples in this region, but some of the artifacts in the Caribbean seem to be made from the same material. Obsidian is kind of a curious one. Now, obsidian, as you know, wherever it's found in the world is highly prized. It's often traded widely. We see this we see this in Oregon, where I live too, pre-contact. This is used widely in Mesoamerica, and I would think we'd probably see it in the Caribbean too, if there were connections going on to places where this was found. Really, though, we only found one flake. This was in Puerto Rico that we have been able to identify to being obsidian. And people have made the connection that, well, we find obsidian in Puerto Rico, it must be coming from probably Central America, kind of making that connection. But I think that's a little tenuous. We do see a lot of obsidian sources in Central America and parts of Mexico. That's possible it could have come that way. We really don't have too many obsidian sources in Northern South America, but we do have some. And so my question was, how did it get there? Are we really looking at kind of a one artifact as being a connective, some of that connective tissue culturally that we see? But what we do know, and we see this in the Pacific Islands quite a bit too, is that obsidian often floats with pumice. It's part of that ejection of material during some volcanic eruptions, and you see this banding sometimes in this pumice. And that's a potential source, I think, of where this can come from. Obsidian is known to move lots of biological organisms. It can move very far away from its original source. And a paper published in PLOS One about 9 years ago showed some of these more recent historically recorded eruptions and where these pumice flows are going. And we see them moving pretty extensively around the world. So I think that's just as likely as somebody moving it, or even more likely. So with all of these kinds of lines of evidence, and I've basically just summarized it, kind of encapsulated as best I could, what factors are we looking at that influence movement over water in the Caribbean before contact that can help us structure how these islands were colonized? Well, when we look at winds and currents, we see a relatively stable pattern happening here. So we see currents that move from the Atlantic, they move westward through the Caribbean, they move between Cuba and the Yucatan, and then kind of move around in a circle in the Gulf of Mexico, and then come back out, forming the Florida current, and then eventually the Gulf current that goes along the eastern seaboard of the United States. And when we look at the pattern of winds and the intensity of winds, we see winds in general, these prevailing trade winds moving also east to west, and these ones down in the southern Caribbean in particular, will go between 20 to 30 kilometers per hour, and that's actually why I like working in this part of the Caribbean, especially on the east sides of the islands, because you have these cool trade winds that blow pretty much consistently all day, almost every day, and it really just keeps you kind of cool when you're doing field work. We can look at some more modern cases of this using satellite imagery, and we see again kind of the same pattern. We see, really this is just taken during one particular date in 2018, but shows you the intensity of these winds in the Northern Atlantic, but also that they're moving from east to west into the Caribbean. And then the same thing for prevailing currents as well. What about archaeological evidence of watercraft manufacture? Well, like most parts of the world, we don't have really a lot of evidence for this, but we do have some. We see the Stargate canoe, which comes from the Bahamas. This was recovered in a blue hole that dates post AD 600. And then we have some canoe fragments from a site called Las Bruciones in Cuba that have not been dated, but show a clear signature of being formed into some kind of watercraft. This site, incidentally, dates to the late part of the ceramic age, as we call it, so probably after about 1000 AD. We do have some paddles, about 14 have been recorded from different places around the Caribbean. And so we do know that they're using paddles as a form of propulsion in the Caribbean. And when we look at ethno-historical analogies, we have some, even Columbus during some of his voyages talked about dozens or maybe even hundreds of people in the Caribbean moving in canoes, but that for the most part, these were smaller, that could carry maybe 5 or 6 or 7 people, maybe more at some times. What we don't really see, though, however, in the Caribbean is we don't see really any evidence of the sail, and we don't see any evidence of stabilization technologies like an outrigger, like we do in some other parts of the world. So we don't see these two kinds of technologies being used. We do see a very strong tendency to use wooden dugout canoes. We don't see any descriptions or evidence that they're modifying those canoes by adding, wash strakes or anything like that to raise the freeboard, but there may be some limited evidence of that, of kind of doing a little bit, but mostly these are just dugout canoes for the most part, as far as we can tell. Okay, so when we look at all of this evidence, this is what Richard Callahan was doing back in the early 2000s, developing ways in which we could test how peoples were moving around the Caribbean with what we kind of had as limited evidence in terms of seafaring technologies, but we had some pretty good archaeological evidence at the time. So this is using wind and current data from the US Navy Marine Climatic Atlas of the world, and they consider a number of different variables like currents and winds and vessel types. And so basically we're saying, if you're in this kind of watercraft and you leave point A, where do you end up? And the computer runs all these simulations, factoring in different times of the year, and then comes to kind of a conclusion about the most likely percentage that a watercraft would have ended up at one place versus another. And so just to show you a schematic of what a couple of these simulations look like, this is leaving Cuba with a southeast heading in spring. And Cuba, you can see that it's it's relatively straightforward with a high success rate of getting land in South America from Cuba. This is leaving Hispaniola, moving south also during the spring. We can see there's also a good likelihood of reaching that. So basically what Richard Callahan was showing was that going back and forth between North and South America and hitting the Greater Antilles, there was a high likelihood that it would happen, at least certainly during certain times of the year. But when you try and leave farther east, like around Trinidad, and try and get up to the Lesser Antilles, it was almost impossible. Those winds and currents were pushing all of those simulation canoes further west. And if you don't have the sail and you're just paddling against those currents and winds is virtually impossible. So when we look at the structure of the Caribbean chronologically, again, if we look at the green, these are very early, and when we look at the red, these are very late. And so what we have is a pattern here that seemed to dovetail with what Richard Callahan was saying in terms of his computer simulations. And this also dovetailed nicely with radiocarbon chronologies that we developed, and we have more than 2,500 dates that we've gone through a process of what we call chronometric hygiene. We're throwing away kind of the dubious dates, the ones that don't make sense or are from bad sample types or whatever, and we come to this sort of summary. So what this basically seems to illustrate is that peoples in the Caribbean were bypassing Lesser Antilles, and they weren't getting there until later in time after some of these northern islands were settled. And this seems to be indicative and follow a pattern of what we see in terms of winds and currents. Okay, so let's shift here quickly to the Pacific. And what can the colonization of the Pacific tell us about seafaring strategies in the Caribbean? So as kind of a comparison, but also in some ways an analog. So the Pacific Ocean is 1/3 of the world's surface area. If you grabbed all of the continents and all the islands in the world together and you put them in one lump, the Pacific would still be bigger. So it's just a massive ocean on a much different scale than the Caribbean. This is about 60 times the size of the Caribbean, in fact, and we have thousands of islands versus dozens of at least larger ones. There are hundreds and hundreds of islands in the Caribbean, but most of these are pretty low and low-lying and small. So we see really just in terms of numbers and size, very, very different. If we were to put the Caribbean into the Pacific, this is kind of what it would look like. Okay, so in terms of patterning of colonization of the Pacific, I'm going to kind of summarize what we see here in terms of colonization. So we can basically break down this area around New Guinea and these islands right here as near Oceania. So these are where islands were colonized, but they were intervisible. So if you got out to an island halfway, you could see at least one or the other. And then the rest of this is what we refer to as remote Oceania. So in terms of peopling of Oceania, what we see here is peoples moving from probably somewhere in the Philippines or Southeast Asia into the Northern Marianas and Guam about 3,300 to 3,000 BP. Palau, where I work, is also settled about the same time. We're not exactly sure where people are coming from, but probably somewhere in this corner of the Northwest Pacific. And then we see peoples known as Lapita, who have established themselves in islands around New Guinea, also on New Guinea in the southern part, and then they begin to move eastward. And they do so between about 3,200 to 3,000 BP. So around this time period, we see lots of different islands in very remote and different parts of the Pacific colonized about the same time, but from different, presumably, origins. Here they stop though, and that's kind of interesting. So they reach as far east as Samoa, and then we have what's called a long pause. We see peoples beginning to move about 1,000 years later into the central and eastern part of the Pacific. And then we see peoples moving out into what we call East Polynesia. So Tahiti, the Cook Islands, and Marquesas. And then they eventually move up to the nodes of the Polynesian Triangle between about 800 and 900 BP. So Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. So Easter Island is actually farther east than what this map shows, but just to show you, this is kind of the chronology that we see. This yellow rectangle in here is an interesting place because we're curious about why peoples would have moved out into this really remote islands like Samoa and Tonga and Fiji, but then not gone any further. What's causing them to have this delay of almost 2,000 years where they're not going further east, south, or north? Okay, so when we look in the Pacific, we see currents and winds basically moving the same way in the Pacific. They're following these trade winds that kind of move across, and there are variations during El Nino, but this is kind of what we generally see. So these prevailing winds in this area, if you look at this graphic, you'll see that the winds and currents kind of, the winds here at least sort of dissipate a little bit. It's not a really windy area that people are having to deal with. And the currents, well, they also kind of show the same thing. If we look at this area of Samoa and Tonga, and this really seems to be the jumping off point for peoples who settle the rest of Polynesia, like Hawaii and New Zealand. So peoples get out here again about 3,300 to 3,000 BP. And then they start to move out again about 2,000 years later. So really curious. Again, this sort of area right here is something that we want to explore. What could be causing this? Is it social? Is it environmental? Is it technologically related? We just kind of don't know. So we began to explore this a little bit using more advanced simulation techniques. And we published our first paper looking at this in the Holocene in 2014. And we looked at what's called an ease of eastward model. So we began to explore why peoples who were moving in this region, what might have been the underlying reasons behind why they didn't go any further. And so what we see here, this yellow triangle superimposed, is that not only do we see fewer islands in here, they're more spatially separated, but we see wind patterns altering as well. We essentially don't really see the same kinds of things happening that we do in other parts of Oceania. Now, we're also interested in looking at El Nino and maybe some effects that was having as well. We see here on the top an El Nino event. And during El Nino, the winds shift the other way. They began to move from west to east. And we see some changes in precipitation as well. And so what this basically is showing us is that during El Nino events, these are really good times for peoples to begin exploring eastward and northward than it is at other times of the year. Now, even though El Nino is episodic, we only get it maybe every 3 to 7 years. We see this as maybe windows of time that could have been conducive for people's moving. And in fact, we seem to see paleoclimatically an increase in the number of El Nino events during the late Holocene. So it's almost as if people are recognizing that these things are happening, there's differences, there's less precipitation, but the winds are shifting that could have allowed people to move in that direction much more easily. We published a follow-up paper a couple years later in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and we also began to look at what we called shortest hop trajectories in conjunction with paleoclimatic movements in these simulations. And basically what this showed was pretty similar. There were periods of time annually, but also episodically, like during El Nino, where it was more conducive for peoples to move from west to east. And we also think that this was only allowable because peoples had developed the double-hulled canoe, which would have allowed more people and provisions to move. So in conjunction with developing bigger watercraft that were just as stable as smaller outriggers and could move farther distances, would have been probably the means for people to do that. And realizing that moving from Tahiti to Hawaii could have taken 2 months to do. And so that's quite a long period of time that would have required provisions and enough people to have a viable colonization group when they got there. When we look at Palau, there's also kind of a curious thing happening too that seafaring simulations can help answer. So when we look at the historic period contacts of islands in Micronesia, we see a lot of these happening in the early to mid 1500s. But Palau, curiously, is not contacted continuously until 1783, when a British ship accidentally wrecks up on its reef. And so prior to this, Palau maybe had one sighting by the Spanish, but no real contact, when all of the other islands around it had been. The Spanish had actually tried to find Palau for decades, both from Guam, where Magellan had first contacted Chamorro groups, and the Philippines. So the Spanish are trying from 2 different places to find islands that they had heard about and were unsuccessful. So why is this the case? And where did Palauans originate from? So we use computer simulations to kind of ask these questions. Where is a likely point and what might have structured these contacts? If we leave Mindanao using these same simulations, we can reach Palau with a fair degree of success, but that's pretty low, only in the fall months. And then if we look at leaving places like Halmahera, our chances of reaching Palau increase. But if we leave from places like New Guinea, you see it's pretty hard to get to Palau. And if we leave from Guam, you see Palau is surrounded here by white area where we don't see any simulated contacts. And this kind of dovetails with what we see historically, where the Spanish are trying to find it and they don't. What's causing this? Well, we see lots of winds and currents that come into contact with the Palauan archipelago that make it extremely treacherous. And we think that this limited or prevented contacts, both in the past and by historic voyages. So Palau essentially was left relatively isolated compared to other islands in Micronesia, which seemingly is related to winds and currents. And then finally, when we look at Magellan's voyages, this is also a curious one too. So why did Magellan encounter such benign weather conditions when he left the Straits and entered the Pacific? And he was the one to name it the Pacific, which has its root word meaning calm. And we know that the Pacific in the southern tip of South America typically is not very calm. Why did he travel so considerably north of the equator when his goal was the Moluccas? And why did he only see 2 uninhabited islands after crossing such a vast distance of ocean? And so when we look at Magellan's voyage, this was really the Spanish attempt to reach the Moluccas without violating the Treaty of Tordesillas, which was drafted by the Pope in 1494, which basically split the world between the Spanish and Portuguese. Of course, not everybody was happy about that. And this was also a means to avoid Africa's Cape Horn, and the Portuguese kind of had a foothold in this region going eastward across the Indian Ocean into Indonesia and the Spice Islands. And so what we see here is that Magellan leaves in September 1519. He's got 5 ships with about 270 men. And just to quickly summarize, he finally is ejected out into the Pacific and it's calm. And so he gives it this name, and that's basically kind of unusual too. And when we look at his voyage, really coming out of the Straits of South America on the 28th of November, 1520, he's only got 3 ships now. 2 others have either left or been destroyed. And he travels across the Pacific, basically just floating, drifting at the mercy pretty much until he gets to Guam on the 6th of March, 1521. So he's traveling for more than 3 months. They're emaciated. They really don't see any inhabited islands. They see the Tuamotus, which is uninhabited. Those islands are uninhabited, and then he gets across. So this is a phenomenal drift voyage, essentially, without seeing any other islands until he reaches Guam. And so the question is, well, if he's traveling in the Moluccas and he knows basically where he needs to go in terms of latitude, but doesn't do it, why is that the case? So he's basically going 1,500 miles north of his directed his intention. And so one of the things that we are curious about here in simulating this voyage is that, one, he traveled so far when he knew he knew where he was going. He had correspondence earlier with a cousin of his, Serrano, who had reached the Spice Islands, and then had later talked about a drought that was happening. And so when we compiled all of this information together and we ran simulations of Magellan's voyage, what we found was that Magellan was able to call it the Pacific. It was these calm conditions when he came out, and what was going to this direction purposely, because this also overlapped with an El Nino event. And so what we showed through these simulations is that even historic voyages are structured by oceanographic and wind currents, some of these El Nino, and this is really the earliest recorded evidence of an El Nino that we have, as shown through these simulations. So in conclusion, in the Caribbean, the winds and currents really facilitated travel, but they hampered development of certain seafaring technologies. And so the Caribbean indigenous peoples who colonized these stretches of islands were able to go between South America and the Greater Antilles and some of these Northern Antilles fairly easily. And because they were able to do that, it really seems to not have spurred the development of other technologies like the sail, which would have allowed them to move eastward against these prevailing currents and winds. In the Pacific, the development of this very distinctive crab claw sail that we see on outriggers may have solved the problem of this eastward movement, but this double hulled canoe, which modern day catamarans are based on, really provided the impetus for colonization of East Polynesia, like Hawaii, New Zealand, Easter Island, and a lot of these islands in between. And that El Nino likely played a role in some of this. And other scholars have talked about the propensity of El Nino during the late Holocene that may have provided this long-term shared knowledge of when these winds were changing, and then able to increase the success rates of going to different places like these very remote islands like Hawaii. And in historic voyages, we also see that they're susceptible to climate like El Nino with Magellan, and that reduced chances of contact. So when we talk about islands being universally interactive or isolated, it's not really one or the other, but there are cases where we do see islands that have remained isolated through time through no purposeful intent, but seems to be structured by different kinds of wind and current patterns that we see. So the moral of the story is necessity really is the mother of invention. So if you really have the desire and the need to go somewhere, you'll probably find a way to do it. In the Caribbean, there was really no need to do that. In the Pacific, there was, despite these episodic changes in El Nino that would have made things a little bit easier. So thank you. Happy future voyages, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone may have.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Scott. This was a really fascinating overview of pre-Columbian archaeology in the Caribbean in the longue durée, together with aspects of island colonization or migration and settlement, trade and material culture. The means that contributed to the movement of people and goods were particularly interesting, in that scholars, especially those working in other island contexts, such as the Mediterranean, can associate with perhaps aspects such as the natural environment, currents and winds, computer simulations, and perhaps other techniques, models, and theoretical approaches can indeed illuminate aspects of such as the early colonization of islands. So thank you very much. You may share your PowerPoint now, and I would like to ask people to address their questions. You can remember, you can either type in your question on the chat on Zoom, or just unmute your microphone, raise your hand, unmute your microphone, and address it directly to our speaker, to Scott Fitzpatrick. There are no questions yet, but Scott, let me address.
I do see one from Christian Rietmeyer.
Right, I'm sorry, I must have missed it. Yes.
Yeah. You want me to answer Christian's first? Yeah. Okay. So So Christian asks, do you have any pre-agrarian island colonization in the Caribbean? And the earliest dates in Cuba appear to be slightly earlier. The answer is we do. It was for a very long time, we thought that peoples before 2500 BP, the Saladoid ceramic making horticultural groups, that there was really no agriculture happening, no kind of cultivation of plants and things. And we are finding more and more evidence over the last 20 years that, yes, they were bringing in presumably some crops from South America, that they were growing them to a limited extent, but it doesn't seem to have been on a very large scale. We see the earliest sort of what we used to call lithic, we kind of call it all now archaic, getting to Cuba, but we don't really see any good evidence for plant like production, like fields of different kinds of plants. We don't see really any evidence for small garden plots. So it seems to be mostly sort of hunting and gathering and foraging and fishing kinds of subsistence strategies early on. And that begins to change over time. During the late archaic, so maybe 3,000, 4,000 years ago, there's pretty good evidence from residue analysis, on artifacts, from pollen and phytoliths recovered from dental calculus, that peoples are definitely eating plant foods, but it doesn't seem to be necessarily good at like intensive agricultural production like we see later in time after about 2,500 years ago. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Scott. I'm sorry, Christian.